Okay, so this is a question from the review, question 8, and this is really about understanding what z-scores have to do with our standard deviation and basically interpreting data, which is very important to do and to be able to do. And so this is one of those questions. So for a set of urine protein measurements, the mean was found to be 50 milligrams a day with a standard deviation of 2 milligrams a day. So we're going to find the z-score for 48 milligrams a day, and then that's part A, and then what percentage will actually be below. And so again, for a word problem, that's really important to understand that type of phrasing. So we've had a question actually with before this question from the review, and it said within, and so from that was a different type of a slightly different calculation. So just again, be very careful of the wording on your test. So the first thing, as I always do, is I take inventory. So the first thing that we have is our mean, which is 50 milligrams a day. And we have our standard deviation of 2 milligrams a day, and we have a specific value, so x is 48 milligrams a day. And so the first thing that we need to use with this information, we need to figure out what exactly that z-score is for 48 milligrams a day. So the first thing that we're going to do, if you look at your review or your formula sheet, our z-score calculation is actually the value of x, okay, which is the 48, subtracted from the mean, divided by our standard deviation. So our value is 48, and we're going to subtract that from the mean, which is 50. It is totally possible to get a negative number. Remember, your standard deviation, like your standard deviation of 1 is plus minus 1. The plus 1 represents values above the average, and the minus represents below. So don't freak out if you're already looking at, oh my God, what's that negative going to mean to us? Okay, we're going to divide that by the standard deviation, which was given to us as 2. So 48 minus 50 is equal to negative 2. We're going to divide that by 2, and that gives us a score of negative 1. So what this is actually, so what that negative 1, so the z-score is equal to negative 1. So what that means to us is that the z-score of negative 1 means that this person has a standard deviation of negative 1, which means that they are one standard deviation below the average, which was 50 milligrams a day. So now we're going to answer part B, which is well, what percent of measurements would be below that 48 a day. So what we're going to do is now look at our empirical laws. So because the standard deviation is 1, well, negative 1 really, which is below, it's still 1, okay, because our standard deviation does include that plus or minus value. So that one standard deviation, whether it's above or below, what that indicates to us is that 68% of values will be found in this in one standard deviation. Okay, but notice that the question isn't asking for within. Okay, it's saying, well, how many would actually fall below? So because the question is asking for below, okay, this is where we have to take our whole population, which would be 100%, and we're going to minus that by 68% to figure out exactly the difference. So what percentage lies outside of that first standard deviation, which is 68%. So 100 minus 68 gives you 32%. So the 32% is telling us that 32% of data will be found outside of one standard deviation. Okay? So, but now we're not asked, the question didn't ask us to specify, well, how much outside of that first standard deviation. It says, well, how many below? So we got to take that 32% and we got to divide it by 2, because that 32% represents, that's both positive and negative. So that represents above, above that +1 standard, above the +1 standard deviation, and it also includes the below, that -1 below standard deviation. So we want to, the question's asking, well, how much will fall below that? So we're not interested in the positive aspect of it or who scored above 1 standard deviation. We're interested in below. That's why we need to divide it by 2. So 32 divided by 2 gives you 16%. So approximately 16% of data would be below 48 milligrams a day. We could extend that question a little further and say, well, how many measurements? And we've actually, that has been asked in the review. How many measurements out of the 50 measurements that were, or out of the measurements that were found? In this particular question, it doesn't tell us how many measurements were made. Let's say, argument's sake, said 100, okay? So if the question actually wanted you to go further and not just get to a percent, but actually, well, how many measurements? Well, you would take your 16, revert it back into its decimal form, and multiply it by the total number of measurements you have to actually get that number. But for this question, it specifically wanted the z-score, which we've determined to be a -1 value, so it's 1 standard deviation below the mean, and 16% of individuals would actually score below that 1 standard deviation of 48 milligrams a day.